How can you read Chinese faster? Which children's books are best for second language learners? And what's the ideal entry point into Chinese literature? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to address 3 questions related to reading in Chinese. I want to discuss these listener and reader questions in this episode because there is a reading challenge on for July. It starts on July 10th and lasts until the end of the month. These challenges are, as usual, completely free to join, and the goal is to encourage you to read a little bit more than you normally do, which will have lots of different positive effects on your Chinese learning. To learn more about the challenge, including what to read and how to read, please check the article linked to in the description of this episode. Today I will talk about reading in Chinese, but if you want a more general approach, including a discussion of what to read in general and what approach you should use, please check out that article. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about 3 questions, and the first one is about reading faster in Chinese. The second one is about using children's books as reading material, and the third question is about getting into Chinese literature. If you have a question you think I should address in an upcoming Q&A, feel free to send me an email at editor@hackingchinese.com or leave a comment over on Hacking Chinese. So the first question today is from Julia, and she wants to know how she can increase reading speed in Chinese. And she doesn't provide context here saying, for example, if it's for an exam or just because she's fed up with reading too slowly in general. But I think most students have been in this situation. Of course, if you're a beginner, your first priority is to be able to read at all. And only when you can do that, you will start thinking about, can I read quickly enough? And if you take a somewhat advanced test, say HSK for example, you will be required to read at a decent pace, and so reading speed can be an issue. And obviously in real life, if you want to really absorb information or do things practically in Chinese, reading at a slow pace, say 1 character per second, is really not feasible because it will take forever to do most of the tasks we want to do. Just to give you some idea of what kind of reading speed might be required on different levels, let's have a look at how quickly you need to read on different levels of the HSK. This is something we covered in episode 43, so check that out if you want the full story about reading speed and exams. So on HSK, just to finish all the text, and this does not give you time to answer the questions, but it still gives you a baseline reading speed. For level 1, you only need to read 13 characters per minute. For level 2, 28 characters per minute. Level 3, 41 characters per minute. Level 4, 59 characters per minute. Level 5, 120 characters per minute. And finally for HSK 6, 130 characters per minute. I have not yet checked these numbers for the new HSK, which currently means level 7 to 9, but we can assume that it's faster than the old HSK 6. Now, like I said, reading speed is important not just for exams, it's important for Chinese being useful in your profession or in other areas where you want to use Chinese. I'm just using this as an example. I used to think that reading speed played too much of a role on proficiency exams, but I've since changed my mind, and check that episode out if you want to know why. Even though it might seem a little bit silly to talk about reading speed when you're reading 10 characters per minute, I do think that reading speed matters on all levels, not just for advanced students. The reason is that when you read Chinese, you need to be good at the things you already know. If you know some characters really well, even if there aren't that many of them, you will find it much easier to absorb and to understand the characters that you don't know as well. This is a kind of fluency development, which is one of Paul Nation's 4 strands, and it's also the strand that is by far the most neglected in formal education. We tend to spend way too much time focusing on new words, new grammar patterns and so on, but knowing what we have already studied very well and quickly is also important, and reading speed could then be said to be a part of fluency development. We spent the entirety of episode 99 talking about fluency development, and if you want to know more about Paul Nation's 4 strands, check out episode 94. So if we look at fluency development, it's mostly about getting better and faster at things you already know, and this makes sense for reading speed too. I mean, it contains the word speed, which is part of what fluency development is all about. The best way to build fluency is to focus on materials where you know almost all the language. So that means, for example, reading a graded reader where you know most of the words, instead of reading increasingly difficult texts in your textbook. The main reason that this is important is that it will expose you to a large number of characters. And I don't mean unique characters here, I mean that you will see some characters over and over, and just the total number of characters that you've read in Chinese will go up dramatically if you switch focus from your textbook to a graded reader. Since the graded reader will be easier, it's also possible to read faster, and you can focus on reading fluency rather than stopping every single sentence, looking up new words, trying to understand the grammar, and so on. Naturally, it's not very realistic to be able to read something above your level at a decent speed, and this is what I mean when I say that this is relevant no matter what level you're on. But of course, for beginners, you will be able to read beginner stuff quickly, and if you're an advanced student, you will be able to read advanced content quickly. If the content is above your level, you will run into many words you don't know and many grammar patterns that you don't know, and this takes up an enormous amount of time, and I would say that that is the biggest speed bump of all. However, one of the most powerful ways of expanding your vocabulary, no matter your level, is through extensive reading, so the remedy here is the same anyway. You simply need to read more and you need to see a lot of text, meaning that you have to read easier texts where you don't have to look things up every sentence. Another thing I want to address before we move on to the next question is that there are a bunch of reading speed techniques floating around online, and you have probably seen these, if nothing else than for your native language. These can involve things like having a pointer and moving that at a certain speed to try to encourage yourself to reading more quickly, which can be a good thing. Simply trying to read faster will usually make you read faster, and you can then get used to this higher pace. But in general, I think most of these speed reading techniques are completely useless for second language learners. The problem for us when we read Chinese is that we're not familiar enough with a script, and stopping to sub-vocalize or use other fancy techniques is not really going to help us that much, because what we are lacking is often simply familiarity with the written language. We simply haven't seen the characters and words enough, and of course sometimes we might encounter characters and words that we haven't seen at all, and then reading more to expand our vocabulary is going to do much more for our reading speed than any fancy technique. That being said, there are some strategies that work really well, and you have probably encountered these in school as well. For example, if you have a goal with reading, it's better to be aware of that goal in advance. If you're trying to answer reading comprehension questions, being clear what those questions are before you start reading is also helpful. Similarly, looking at the structure of the text, reading any headings in advance, looking at the images and so on can also help you form a picture of what this is about in advance, and that will help with processing enormously. I haven't written about this specifically on Hacking Chinese yet, at least not for reading, but we did talk about this in my Beyond Ting Bodong series for listening comprehension, and the concepts there are more or less the same, and so I will link to that series in the show notes. Moving on to question number 2, which is from Samuel, who wants to know how he can use children's books and stories to improve his reading skills, and also if I can recommend any specific titles. This question ties in well with what I just said about extensive reading and about fluency development, because reading children's books is obviously easier than reading books for adults, and so focusing on something that is easy, where you can do extensive reading, is a good thing. Now, there is a problem here though, and that is that children's books in Chinese are not as easy as you think. There are 2 reasons for this, one which is related to children's books in general, and one which is specific for Chinese. First, children's books can be quite hard, and that is because they contain a lot of language that simply isn't relevant for adult second language learners. If you think back to children's books you read when you were a kid, you can probably come up with lots of things like, for example, the names of lots of animals and plants, and the noises that these animals make, and silly rhymes and so on. And these things might be cute, but it's typically not what you want to focus on as a second language learner, and you probably haven't focused on it before, so when you read these books, these things will make them harder. The second problem, which as far as I know is somewhat specific to Chinese, is that children's books in Chinese are harder in general than they are in English. And I think the main reason for this is that the goal is often to educate the children. It is to teach them the Chinese language, not really just to write an entertaining story that makes the child fall in love with reading, for example. Sure, this can be some kind of stretch goal, but based on the children's books I've read in Chinese, it seems clear that the authors also want to teach specific vocabulary, maybe chengyu, maybe other types of phrases or more formal language that the children typically wouldn't use, and that they would find difficult as well. In a sense, you can think of children's books in Chinese as slightly more lightweight textbooks, where the point is to educate, not to entertain. This makes these books even worse for second language learners, and if you don't know this, you will also be highly discouraged when you pick up a children's book, because you might think it ought to be easy, but then when you start reading it, you figure out that there are so many new characters and words that you don't know, and you feel, well, maybe my reading ability isn't as good as I thought it was. I've used this example before on the podcast, but I read through a series of books when I started learning Chinese. I think I've been learning for about a year, and I bought a series of children's books that looked very friendly. The characters in them are really big, there are lots of cute characters, and so on. So I thought this would be easy. Back then, it was a bit difficult for me to realize how difficult some of the vocabulary was, but I've browsed through that list, which was around 800 words in total for that short children's book, and I can tell you in hindsight that most of those words I could have ignored entirely, and indeed I could have skipped the entire book. Some of the words were just a little bit more formal or literary, and I ended up learning them later, but many of them are extremely specific and definitely not something I needed to learn as a beginner or even as an intermediate learner. So I'm not saying that all children's books in Chinese are like this and that they are all useless, but I am warning against thinking that they are easy as you'd imagine a children's book in English being, because often that is not the case. They contain tons of words that you might not need. So while the basic idea here that Samuel has is correct, that is to say, he wants to seek out things that are easier to read to ease himself into reading more difficult material, that is great, but do that by focusing on graded readers to begin with, and as your reading ability improves, you can switch that for more authentic content later. If you have access to children's books and want to give them a go, I mean, by all means do so, but this will be very intensive reading, similar to reading a difficult textbook. It will not be the extensive reading that I've been recommending so far. This is a good segue into question 3, and of course I didn't arrange the questions in this order by chance. So let's talk a little bit about literature in Chinese and how you can start tackling authentic content. Authentic means that it's not written with language learning purposes in mind. So for example, a graded reader is not authentic content, a textbook is not authentic content either, but anything written for native speakers is authentic content. And generally speaking, of course, authentic content will be harder. You can find authentic content that isn't necessarily that difficult. It depends on the purpose for which it was written. But in general, people who write for you specifically will do a better job of producing text that you can make sense of. Like I just said when we talked about children's books, this means that unless your level is quite high, you shouldn't spend most of your time with authentic content because you will spend 90% of that with a dictionary and 10% actually reading the text, and that will not expose you to enough Chinese and it probably won't be very enjoyable either. Just like with the children's books though, this doesn't mean that you should never do it, it just means that it shouldn't be your main diet, as it were. The question here comes from Hiroshi, and he wants to know if there are any specific genres of Chinese literature that are easier to read for language learners and therefore better to start with. This assumes you have a certain base reading ability, as I've already described, but assuming you have that, where should you start? Before we talk about literature specifically, which is what Hiroshi asks about here, I do want to mention that literature is already towards the harder end of the spectrum, and I'm talking about the spectrum of difficulty for authentic material in general. One way of looking at this and thinking about the difficulty of a text is to consider why it's written, and how it is written and for what purpose. Consider, for example, instructions. They are meant to be clear, they are written to be as easy to understand as possible, and reading this kind of text is clearly easier than reading, say, a novel. This is also true for texts that try to teach you something. For example, if you read a history book or a book about biology, the language in those books will be easier than you think. And I think this is sometimes counter to what most people think. They might think that, okay, reading a story, say a novel or short story, is easier than reading a science textbook. But in my experience, it is completely the other way around. Reading scientific literature in Chinese can be hard before you learn certain words, but in general, it isn't that bad, whereas reading, say, literature can be really hard. This is not strange when you think about it, because when you write a novel or when you write literature in general, you typically don't want to repeat yourself. You want to use a varied language. You want to show everybody how educated you are and how many words you know, and you want to show that you can use them correctly, and so on and so forth. Compare this with somebody writing a science textbook. Of course, we want to use the same name for the same thing, because otherwise a textbook would be extremely confusing. I mean, this is what terminology is about. We agree that one thing is called only this and nothing else, and then we stick to that term throughout the text. Compare this if we're writing a novel. You might deliberately change the term and sometimes use a pronoun, sometimes use a name, sometimes use a description, but we're all pointing towards the same object or person. This variety is, of course, part of the reason why it's enjoyable to read books written by people who really know how to write well, but it also makes it harder for second language learners to read this type of text. Hiroshi's question here, though, is about literature. It is not about textbooks, and it's not about reading instructions or any other authentic text. It is specifically about literature. So let's talk a little bit about that. Just like we saw with children's books, I think there is more emphasis on using fancy language in Chinese literature compared to English literature. And this is a very broad generalization, and I'm not implying that all books will be like this. But for example, in English, we have authors who are kind of famous for using simple language. Two authors I like in this category are Ernest Hemingway and Graham Greene. And they both write in a very approachable way, so if you read them as a student of English, you wouldn't think that these books are extremely difficult to read, compared with many other authors in English. I remember discussing Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea with a Chinese student who had read the book in English in high school and kind of wondered why this book was famous. It didn't contain many fancy words, except maybe lots of names for fish and things like that. But beyond that, the language is very plain, and yet this book is apparently very famous, which this person thought strange. So this brings us back to the question where you should start. And while I think there might be genres that are easier to read than others, for example, I think if you stick to a modern setting, that's going to be easier, or just in general picking a setting that you're roughly familiar with. A story written in Chinese that takes place in your country will be easier to understand than one that's put in rural China if you've never been there and you don't know what life was like. Similarly, don't pick genres that include lots of old-fashioned language. So if you're going to start with something, maybe don't pick wuxia novels, because they are like fantasy in English, where you use lots of language that sounds a little bit old-fashioned or at least mimics an older style, and this will certainly be harder to read. However, I do think that this discussion is missing the point a bit, because when you're trying to read something in Chinese, something that is much more important than exactly how difficult it is how interested you are in reading it. If you love wuxia novels, you should definitely read them. I mean, maybe you haven't read any yet, but you like the genre, you've watched the movies, and you want to read these novels, then go ahead and do that. If you are truly motivated to read something, this is much more powerful and much more important than if this genre happens to be a little bit more difficult than another genre. So while it may be that some genres are easier than others, pick something that you're really interested in and just try out different authors and see what you think. Differences between authors can also be bigger than differences between genres, so don't just pick one book and stick with it. Read a few pages in several books by several different authors and see which one you think is the most approachable. Finally, I would recommend a technique you can use to ease yourself into reading novels in Chinese if you've never done this, and that is to read something you have already read in your native language. For example, take your favorite book in your native language and read that book translated into Chinese. This means that you're guaranteed to like it. Maybe you haven't read it in a while, so this will also be re-experiencing the story and the characters and so on. And beyond that, you will already be familiar with the context, with the setting, with the plot, with the characters and so on, and this will make it much, much easier to get into the story and follow what's going on. If you think about it, this is just a different way of saying the same things I said about reading speed for exams earlier, where I said you can read the questions and look at the headlines and so on. Because if you pick a book that you already know about and you know these things, that will make parsing and processing the written language so much easier. Maybe you don't want to stick to reading translated works all the time because the language is a little bit different compared to works that were written in Chinese in the first place, but getting started this way is a great idea. I've used this method successfully myself 3 times with 3 different languages. First when I started reading in English back in junior high school, and then I did it with French, and then finally with Chinese as well. And I think this is a great way to get into literature, and it's almost guaranteed to give you a much more pleasant experience than picking a random book off the shelf. I've written more about this particular method and also about different reading techniques in general and how you can approach reading in Chinese, and I'll put links to these in the show notes. Thus, we reach the end of this episode. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope to see you in the reading challenge. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.